By 1492, the Iberian Peninsula had undergone centuries of territorial consolidation, leaving the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada as the sole remaining Islamic sovereign entity in the region. This state, established in 1238, had survived primarily through a sophisticated tributary system known as Piraeus, wherein the Nasrids transferred substantial quantities of African gold to the Crown of Castile to ensure temporary non-aggression. The geopolitical landscape shifted fundamentally following the 1469 union of Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, merging the peninsula's two most formidable Christian military and fiscal powers. This dynastic alliance transformed the intermittent border skirmishes of the Reconquista into a centralized, state-funded campaign of total territorial absorption. Granada occupied a strategic but increasingly isolated position, protected by the rugged topography of the Sierra Nevada, but severed from its traditional North African military reinforcements by Christian naval dominance in the Strait of Gibraltar. Internally, the emirate was paralyzed by a protracted civil war between the factions of the reigning Sultan Abu el-Hasan Ali and his son Muhammad the Fuhurth, commonly known as Boabdil. The Catholic monarchs utilized this political fragmentation to implement a war of attrition, systematically seizing frontier fortresses through heavy artillery and scorched earth tactics. Unlike previous centuries of fluctuating borders, the 1482-1492 conflict was characterized by a permanent military infrastructure and an unprecedented demand for liquid capital to sustain a standing professional army. The geopolitical objective was no longer the extraction of tribute, but the legal and religious unification of the Spanish realms. Consequently, Granada became an economic bottleneck, where the survival of the Nasrid dynasty depended on its ability to pay for defense, while the Christian monarchs required massive credit facilities to finance a siege of such prolonged duration and technological complexity. This convergence of military necessity and fiscal exhaustion set the stage for a new architecture of credit. The fiscal viability of the Granada campaign rested upon the administrative expertise of a small Jewish elite led by Abraham Sr. and Isaac Abravanel. Sr., serving as the Rab de la Court and chief tax farmer of Castile, occupied a singular position within the royal household, managing the rentas reales to ensure a consistent flow of liquidity to the front lines. His operational capacity was augmented in 1484 by the arrival of Isaac Abravanel, a statesman and financier who had previously managed the treasury of the Portuguese House of Braganza. Together, these architects of royal credit operated as the primary intermediaries between the crown's immense military expenditures and the kingdom's dispersed capital reserves. Their strategy was rooted in a calculated exchange of financial support for political protection, viewing the total consolidation of the Christian state as the only mechanism capable of shielding the Jewish community from the rising radicalism of the Holy Office. Abravanel, specifically, applied sophisticated Portuguese banking techniques to the Spanish war effort, utilizing short-term credit facilities to bridge the gap between tax cycles and active military operations. This relationship allowed Isabella and Ferdinand to bypass the restrictive oversight of the Cortes, accessing private Jewish capital to fund the acquisition of expensive heavy artillery and the maintenance of a professional logistics train. Senior's extensive network of tax collectors and subcontractors functioned as a state within a state, providing the logistical backbone for the military buildup at Santa Fe. For these financiers, the Reconquista was not merely a religious crusade, but a strategic opportunity to institutionalize their necessity to the state. By integrating Jewish wealth into the core machinery of the royal treasury, they aimed to create a legal dependency that would render expulsion politically and economically impossible. This convergence of personal ambition and communal survival transformed Senior and Abravanel into the definitive financiers of the nascent Spanish Empire as they leveraged their transnational credit networks to underwrite a war that was as much a triumph of accounting as it was of arms. The 1469 marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the prerequisite for the final assault on Granada, was secured through the financial intervention of Abraham Sr. and his associate Pedro de la Cavalleria. At the time of the clandestine negotiations, the Castilian treasury was severely depleted by civil unrest, rendering the crown incapable of funding the diplomatic missions or the essential marriage gifts required to solidify the alliance. Senior orchestrated the initial loan of 20,000 sueldos to cover Ferdinand's perilous journey across the frontier in disguise, ensuring the prince reached Valladolid to meet his future queen. This capital was not a simple donation, but a sophisticated advancement against future tax yields, structured to bypass the legal restrictions imposed by Isabella's brother, Henry IV, who opposed the union. Furthermore, the necessary papal dispensation for the marriage, required due to the couple's consanguinity, was procured through Jewish diplomatic channels in Rome, utilizing their established ties with the Curia to navigate the complex ecclesiastical bureaucracy. The administrative planning extended to the creation of a secret fiscal infrastructure that allowed the couple to maintain an independent court before their official accession. This period of shadow governance was sustained by the de la Cavalleria family, who managed the distribution of liquid funds to loyalist nobles whose military support was essential for the impending war. By underwriting the dynastic merger, the Jewish financiers were effectively purchasing a stake in a unified Spanish state, shifting their role from local moneylenders to strategic partners in a trans-regional project. This institutional investment provided the foundational stability for the joint monarchy, proving that the unification of Spain was as much a product of private credit as it was of royal bloodlines. The Jewish elite's commitment to financing the Granada War was predicated on a survival strategy known as vertical alliances, where a vulnerable minority sought protection through absolute utility to the sovereign. By 1480, the rise of the Inquisition and the implementation of the Limpieza de Sangre statutes created a hostile legal environment that threatened the community's social and economic standing. The financiers believed that by underwriting the state's primary ideological objective, the elimination of Islamic rule, they could secure a powerful sanctuary that would render the crown a permanent debtor to its Jewish subjects. This relationship operated as a double-edged sword. While it centralized their legal protection under royal jurisdiction, it simultaneously concentrated their vulnerability, as their physical safety became inextricably linked to the personal caprice and fiscal solvency of Ferdinand and Isabella. The elite utilized their intellectual capital to frame their financial contributions as an essential pillar of the emerging modern state, aiming to transform their status from tolerated outsiders into indispensable administrative facilitators. They calculated that the massive scale of the war's debt would create a structural barrier against expulsion, as the crown could not realistically liquidate its obligations to the very creditors who managed its tax collection apparatus. Furthermore, the Jewish leadership viewed the conquest as a means to suppress local anti-Semitic violence by aligning themselves with the monarch's centralized military authority, which held a monopoly on legitimate force. This motive was not born of religious zeal for the Christian cause, but of a cold, pragmatic assessment of the geopolitical shifts in Iberia. They gambled that a unified, triumphant monarchy would prioritize fiscal continuity and administrative stability over the populous demands for religious homogeneity. Thus, the financing of Granada was an attempt to purchase a permanent legal footing within a consolidated Spanish realm, using liquid wealth as a shield against the rising tide of institutional exclusion. By the late 1480s, the Spanish credit market was fundamentally shaped by the Catholic Church's prohibition of usury, defined as the charging of any interest on loans between Christians. This canonical restriction created a systemic commercial vacuum, as the burgeoning costs of the Granada War necessitated access to liquid capital that the traditional agrarian economy could not provide. While Christian merchants and noblemen were legally constrained from profiting through direct lending, the Jewish community operated under a distinct legal and religious framework. that permitted the extension of credit to non-coreligionists. This institutional exclusion of Christians from the credit industry transformed Jewish financiers into the realm's primary source of non-feudal capital. Unlike the nobility, whose wealth was largely immobilized in land and entailed estates, the Jewish urban elite maintained high levels of liquidity through active engagement in the Mediterranean bullion trade and international mercantile networks. This financial specialization allowed for the creation of sophisticated credit instruments that bridged the gap between the crown's immediate military requirements and the long-term collection of royal taxes. The resulting dependence was not merely a convenience, but a structural necessity. Without Jewish intermediaries to absorb the legal and spiritual risks of usury, the Christian state lacked the mechanism to monetize its future revenues. Furthermore, the absence of a centralized national bank meant that private Jewish capital functioned as the de facto treasury for the war effort. This role was intensified by the community's expertise in managing complex exchange rates and the transfer of specie, skills that were scarce among the Christian aristocracy. Consequently, the usury ban effectively granted the Jewish community a monopoly over the kingdom's financial services, positioning them at the center of the royal war machine while simultaneously fueling the populist resentment that would eventually destabilize their presence in the Iberian Peninsula. The legal foundation of Jewish participation in the Granada War was the doctrine of servi camere regis, or servants of the king's chamber, which placed the community under the immediate and exclusive jurisdiction of the monarchy. This designation bypassed the traditional feudal hierarchy, exempting Jewish financiers from the authority of local manorial lords, municipal councils, and ecclesiastical courts. In the 1480s, this singular relationship transformed the Jewish elite into direct fiscal agents of the crown, whose person and assets were legally categorized as royal property. This extra-legal status allowed Ferdinand and Isabella to deploy Jewish capital with a degree of flexibility unattainable within the rigid framework of common law or the constraints of the Cortes. As servants of the chamber, the community functioned outside the standard tax structures of the realm, enabling the monarchs to negotiate private, high-stakes loans directly with individuals like Abraham Sr. This vertical legal bond provided the community with a potent, albeit conditional, sanctuary. Any injury against a Jewish subject was adjudicated as a direct violation of the king's own interest and treasury. However, this lack of common law protection entrenched the community's systemic vulnerability, as their residency rights remained a matter of royal prerogative rather than established civil right. The monarchs utilized this absolute ownership to treat Jewish wealth as a strategic reserve, extracting extraordinary levies that were functionally distinct from the subsidies granted by the Christian estates. By positioning themselves as the sole legal shield for the community, the Catholic monarchs secured the total loyalty of the financiers, who understood that their survival was entirely dependent on the continued solvency and favor of the royal chamber. This administrative isolation turned the Jewish quarters into controlled economic zones, where the crown could maximize fiscal extraction to underwrite the unprecedented military expenditures required for the final conquest. The fiscal mobilization for the Granada War relied on the integration of tax farming with the provision of immediate, high-volume credit. Under the direction of Abraham Sr. and his network of arrendadores, the Jewish elite managed the collection of the rentas reales, the primary indirect taxes on commerce, transit, and consumer goods. This administrative framework allowed the crown to monetize future revenue streams. The Jewish financiers provided the monarchs with instant liquid capital in exchange for the legal right to collect specific taxes at a later date. This system, known as the encabezamiento, transferred the operational risk of revenue collection from the state to the private sector, ensuring that Ferdinand and Isabella could sustain the high daily costs of a standing army regardless of the kingdom's agricultural cycles. The tax farmers operated through a tiered bureaucracy of sub-collectors, who were often members of the local Jewish urban elite. providing a granular level of fiscal oversight that the Crown's own fledgling administration could not replicate. These contracts were structured as competitive bids, where the financier guaranteed a fixed sum to the royal treasury, retaining any surplus collected as profit to cover interest and administrative overhead. During the final decade of the Reconquista, this network became the primary collateral for the royal debt. The Crown issued orders for repayment that were tied directly to the proceeds of specific tax farms in cities like Seville and Toledo. This mechanism effectively collateralized the kingdom's commercial activity, turning the Jewish community into the primary underwriters of the state's solvency. The transparency of this network allowed royal accountants to gauge the kingdom's total assessable wealth with high precision, enabling the periodic extraction of extraordinary levies. By controlling the collection of the realm's revenue, the Jewish financiers maintained a strategic grip on the state's lifeline, ensuring that their role as credit providers was inseparable from their function as the kingdom's most efficient administrative engine. The logistical demands of the Granada War necessitated the movement of capital across sovereign borders, a task facilitated by the transnational familial and commercial networks of the Jewish diaspora. Unlike the Christian banking houses of the era, which often faced political interference during times of war, Jewish merchant networks in North Africa, Italy, and the Levant provided a redundant and secure infrastructure for the transfer of bullion. These financiers utilized sophisticated bills of exchange to facilitate the movement of value without the physical transit of gold or silver, thereby mitigating the risks of piracy and land-based theft. This system relied on the internal trust of the Sephardic merchant class, allowing a deposit in Seville to be instantly credited to a contractor in Naples or a supplier in the Maghreb. During the 1480s, these flows were essential for the procurement of high-quality sulfur and saltpeter for gunpowder, materials that were often sourced through Mediterranean channels where Jewish intermediaries held dominant market positions. Furthermore, the financiers acted as experts in the trade of foreign specie, stabilizing the Castilian mint by sourcing African gold through trans-Saharan trade routes managed by Jewish communities in Tlemcen and Oran. This influx of new gold allowed the Crown to maintain the purity of its coinage despite the inflationary pressures of prolonged mobilization. The Jewish elite also managed the currency arbitrage between the gold standard economies of the Islamic world and the silver-based systems of Christian Europe, extracting profit from the exchange while ensuring the royal treasury maintained a balanced reserve of both metals. This cross-border capacity turned the Jewish community into a primitive international central bank, capable of bypassing local economic depressions to inject liquidity into the Spanish war machine at critical strategic junctures. By integrating the local Reconquista into the broader Mediterranean commercial system, these financiers provided Ferdinand and Isabella with the financial reach required to outpace the Nasrid treasury, which lacked equivalent access to globalized credit networks. To secure the unprecedented volume of private loans required for the final decade of the Reconquista, Jewish financiers implemented the bipartite indenture, a sophisticated contractual mechanism designed to prevent litigation and fraud. This instrument, also known as a chirograph, consisted of a single parchment containing two identical copies of the debt agreement, which was then severed along an irregular serpentine line. The Jewish creditor retained one half, while the matching counterfoil was held by the Christian debtor or deposited with a neutral third party, such as a municipal notary or a royal official. This physical split ensured that the contract's validity could only be confirmed by joining the two halves, as the unique serrated edges functioned as a primitive but infallible cryptographic proof. In the context of the Granada War, these indentures primarily recorded the debts of the high nobility, who borrowed heavily to equip their private retinues and maintain their feudal obligations to the Crown. Unlike standard commercial loans, these agreements often utilized a pledge of land or future rents as collateral, effectively mortgaging the hereditary estates of the Castilian aristocracy to Jewish capital. The documentation was standardized and rigorous, detailing the principal amount, the specific repayment dates, and the penalties for default, which often included the immediate transfer of property titles to the lender. By 1489, this system had created a vast physical archive of the realm's indebtedness, rendering the financial obligations of the ruling class transparent to the royal administration. This formalization of debt allowed the crown to monitor the solvency of its vassals while providing Jewish lenders with a legally enforceable claim that was recognized by the royal courts. Consequently, the bipartite indenture was not merely a record of transaction, but a strategic tool of statecraft. It integrated the personal wealth of the nobility into the state's war machine, ensuring that the Christian aristocracy remained financially tethered to the success of a campaign underwritten by Jewish expertise. The operational success of the Granada War was contingent upon a sophisticated supply chain managed by Jewish merchants who functioned as the primary procurers of strategic commodities. Beyond providing liquid capital, these individuals organized the massive logistical throughput required to sustain a professional army of 50,000 in the field for a decade. The Jewish elite leveraged their established dominance in urban commercial guilds to secure bulk quantities of grain, oil, and wine, preventing the systemic starvation that frequently collapsed medieval sieges. They utilized a network of specialized depots and military nodes, like Cordoba and Jaén, where goods were warehoused and distributed under royal license. Crucially, these merchants acted as catalysts for the development of military industries, financing the large-scale production of cloth for uniforms and the artisanal labor required for armor and weaponry. This role extended to the procurement of strategic materials, such as livestock and pack animals, essential for the transport of heavy siege engines across the rugged Andalusian terrain. The Jewish urban centers in Andalusia became critical processing hubs where raw materials were converted into military supplies, effectively integrating the local economy into the state's war machine. This involvement spurred a period of accelerated commercial growth in the region, as the crown's demand for high-volume delivery bypassed traditional localized market restrictions. Jewish agents also managed the victualling contracts for the royal court and high nobility, ensuring that the political leadership remained insulated from the logistical failures of the front lines. By professionalizing the procurement process, these financiers transformed the siege of Granada from an intermittent feudal obligation into a continuous industrial-scale operation. The sustained fiscal pressure of the final decade of the Reconquista led to the institutionalization of the juro, a state-backed debt bond that functioned as a perpetual or life annuity. This instrument allowed the Catholic monarchs to capitalize on the financial reservoir of the Jewish urban elite, converting private liquid wealth into long-term sovereign debt. Unlike the short-term advancements associated with tax farming, the juro represented a formal contract where the crown received a massive lump sum of immediate liquidity in exchange for an annual interest payment, typically around 10%. These payments, known as situaciones, were legally pledged against specific, reliable revenue streams, such as the alcabala sales tax or the tercios reales. The Jewish community became the primary holders of these bonds, seeking the relative security of state-guaranteed income amidst a volatile economic landscape. This system introduced a revolutionary level of financial abstraction. The juro was a transferable asset that could be sold, bequeathed, or used as collateral in secondary markets, effectively creating the first modern market for government securities in Iberia. For the monarchs, this was a critical fiscal tool that decoupled military spending from the constraints of immediate tax collection, enabling the crown to maintain a state of permanent mobilization. For the Jewish financiers, the purchase of juros was an act of institutional integration, anchoring their capital to the long-term survival and prosperity of the Christian state. By 1490, the total volume of juros issued had transformed the royal treasury into a debt-driven enterprise, where the ongoing military prosecution depended on the willingness of Jewish investors to exchange their liquid specie for future promises of state revenue. This architecture of credit formalized the monarch's ability to spend tomorrow's wealth today, cementing the juro as the definitive financial pillar of the nascent Spanish Empire. The mobilization of capital during the final Nasrid conflict necessitated the widespread adoption of the lettre de cambio, or bill of exchange, which functioned as a non-specie payment system. This instrument enabled Jewish financiers to settle large-scale military debts across various Castilian cities without the logistical burden of transporting bullion through contested territories. The mechanism operated as a four-party credit contract. A remitter delivered funds to a drawer in one location, who then issued a document ordering a drawee in a distant city to pay a designated payee. This process effectively transformed credit into a liquid medium of exchange, alleviating the persistent shortage of minted coinage that hampered the royal treasury. Jewish merchant bankers utilized their presence in major commercial hubs like Toledo, Seville, and Burgos to act as the primary clearinghouses for these transactions. The inherent value of the bill resided in the usance period, the time allowed for the document to travel and be honored, which allowed the Crown to defer actual payments while maintaining the active movement of supplies and personnel. Furthermore, these instruments facilitated sophisticated currency arbitrage between the various regional denominations circulating within the peninsula. Because the Church's scrutiny of usury focused on overt interest, Jewish lenders often incorporated their profit margins into the exchange rate fluctuations between the point of issue and the point of payment. This practice, known as dry exchange, allowed for the hidden accumulation of interest under the guise of commercial risk. The integration of these credit instruments allowed the Catholic monarchs to synchronize their fiscal resources with the rapid pace of the 1482 to 1492 campaigns. By centralizing these exchange nodes, the Jewish elite created a virtual financial network that sustained the Christian state's solvency, proving that the victory at Granada was technically underwritten by the sophisticated manipulation of paper-based assets. Jewish involvement in the bullion trade provided the Spanish monarchs with the physical specie required to operate a cash-based military economy. While previous fiscal mechanisms leveraged future revenues, the day-to-day operation of the Granada campaign necessitated uncoined gold and silver to satisfy the immediate demands of foreign infantry and logistical contractors. Jewish money changers, or cambistas, functioned as the kingdom's primary assayers, utilizing the touchstone to verify the fineness of diverse Mediterranean currencies. This technical expertise allowed the Crown to stabilize the value of the excellent, the primary gold coin, against the persistent threat of currency debasement prevalent in the 15th century. Merchant houses specializing in the trade of scrap systematically collected fractured jewelry, liturgical silver, and worn coinage, funneling these raw materials into the royal mints of Segovia and Seville. This procurement was vital during periods of extreme scarcity, as the famine of money often halted military advances more effectively than enemy resistance. Furthermore, the Jewish elite managed the logistics of the Guinea gold trade, sourcing unminted dust through intermediaries in the Maghreb and Portuguese-held Arguin. By acting as the principal suppliers of bullion to the Casa de la Moneda, these financiers ensured that the Crown possessed the physical metal necessary to strike new denominations at the pace of wartime inflation. This role extended to the clandestine melting and recasting of bullion to prevent the flight of high-quality specie across the border to rival states. The administrative oversight of the royal mints often fell to Jewish officials who applied strict standards of weight and purity, thereby maintaining the international credibility of Spanish coinage. Consequently, the Jewish community served as the physical gatekeeper of the kingdom's metallic wealth, ensuring that the abstract promises of the juro and the lettre de cambio were underpinned by a reliable supply of physical bullion. The financing of the 1482-1492 campaigns required a deep penetration of the rural productive sector, extending credit beyond urban commerce into the fundamental agrarian economy. Jewish creditors utilized the mechanism of compra de frutos, or the purchase of future harvests, to secure liquidity against upcoming yields of wheat, barley, and wine. This practice allowed both the crown and the landed nobility to capitalize on the productive potential of their estates months before the physical harvest was realized. Financiers assessed the productive capacity of specific Castilian and Andalusian manors, valuing land not as a static feudal asset, but as a source of recurring, predictable revenue. The collateralization of the Mesta's wool production was particularly significant, as the high-value export of merino wool provided the necessary specie to satisfy international debt obligations. Lending was frequently structured through censos al quitar, a type of redeemable annuity where the borrower pledged the annual rents of rural properties to the financier. These arrangements shifted the inherent volatility of the agricultural market, such as the risk of crop failure or seasonal price fluctuations, onto the Jewish lender, who factored these variables into the cost of the advance. The Jewish elite acted as agricultural commodity brokers, often collecting repayment in kind through grain or silk, and subsequently liquidating these assets in urban markets or supplying them directly to royal military outposts. This created a sophisticated linkage between the traditional landholding system and the liquid mercantile economy. The Crown utilized these agricultural futures to ensure the professional army remained provisioned during the dormant winter months when traditional tax collection was minimal. By assessing land rents with actuarial precision, Jewish financiers enabled the mobilization of the latent wealth of the Spanish countryside. This agricultural credit infrastructure ensured that the protracted nature of the siege did not result in the bankruptcy of the landed aristocracy, whose feudal income was thus converted into active military capital. The sustained military operations against the Nasrid kingdom necessitated a shift from contractual credit to the arbitrary tallage, an extraordinary levy imposed when voluntary loans and juro sales proved insufficient to cover the escalating costs of the 1490-1491 campaign. Unlike the servitium negotiated with the Christian nobility, these tallages were non-consensual and functioned outside the oversight of the Cortes. The Crown utilized its absolute jurisdictional authority over the aljamas to extract capital based solely on the royal commissioners' perceived ability to pay. These auditors conducted rigorous inspections of communal ledgers and the archae to determine the maximum capacity for extraction, often setting quotas that far outstripped available liquid specie. Enforcement was managed by royal justices who possessed summary powers to imprison communal leaders or seize personal properties, including silver plate and jewels, if the assigned sums were not delivered within rigid deadlines. This fiscal mechanism effectively monetized the community's very existence, treating their accumulated assets as a strategic treasury that could be tapped without legal recourse. The frequency of these levies increased as the Christian army established the permanent camp at Santa Fe, where the daily expense of the professional infantry required immediate cash infusions that tax farming could not provide. Critically, the tallage acted as a primary tool for wealth redistribution, funneling the profits of private Jewish commerce directly into the royal war chest. It reduced the community's operating capital, forcing a transition from active lending to passive fiscal depletion. By 1491, the arbitrary tallage had transformed the Jewish financiers from strategic partners into a captive revenue stream whose wealth was being systematically consumed by the very state infrastructure it had originally built. This policy of exhaustive taxation ensured that the Crown maintained its offensive momentum while simultaneously eroding the economic independence of its most vital creditors. The 1487 siege of Malaga represented the most resource-intensive naval and terrestrial operation of the Granada War, necessitating a concentrated injection of liquid capital to maintain a blockade of the Mediterranean's primary Nasrid port. Following the city's unconditional surrender after 3 months of attrition, the Catholic monarchs implemented a policy of total enslavement for the remaining population, a measure designed to liquidate human assets into immediate state revenue. Among the captives were approximately 450 Jewish residents whose fate became a central mechanism for further royal extortion. Abraham Sr. and Isaac Abravanel were tasked with coordinating a massive redemption effort, leveraging the religious obligation of Pidion Shvuyim to mobilize the remaining wealth of the Castilian and Aragonese aljamas. The crown set an exorbitant ransom price of approximately 20 million maravedis for the release of these individuals, a sum that functionally operated as a voluntary but coerced capital levy. This redemption was not a simple act of communal charity. It was a strategic fiscal maneuver where the crown utilized Jewish religious law to extract gold that was otherwise protected or hidden. The payments were structured in rigid installments, ensuring a consistent flow of specie into the royal war chest precisely when the costs of the subsequent campaigns in Baza and Guadix were peaking. Furthermore, the Jewish communities were required to provide additional donations to cover the transport and maintenance of the captives until the full ransom was satisfied. This process systematically drained the liquid reserves of the Jewish urban centers, converting communal solidarity into a direct military subsidy. By the time the final installment was paid, the crown had successfully recaptured the liquid wealth of the Malaga community, while simultaneously imposing a crippling financial burden on the Jewish population of the interior, effectively funding the next phase of the conquest with the price of Jewish survival. The expansion of the Spanish state during the Granada War necessitated an administrative expertise that transcended simple fiscal lending. This intellectual capital was centered on the Jewish community's linguistic proficiency, particularly their command of Arabic, Castilian, and Latin. This polyglot capability rendered individuals like Isaac Abravanel indispensable as diplomatic intermediaries during the negotiation of surrender treaties known as capitulaciones. Christian royal officials frequently lacked the linguistic nuance required to navigate the complex legal and honor-based frameworks of the Nasrid court, making Jewish translators the primary facilitators of territorial transition. Beyond linguistics, the community provided the technological bedrock for the state's burgeoning bureaucracy. Their mastery of advanced accounting methods, derived from Mediterranean mercantile traditions, allowed the royal household to implement a centralized system of record-keeping that tracked military expenditures with unprecedented accuracy. Jewish scholars also provided essential scientific data, utilizing astronomical tables and calendrical calculations to coordinate the logistics of seasonal campaigns and naval movements in the Strait of Gibraltar. This expertise extended into the judicial realm, where Jewish legal specialists assisted in the drafting of municipal ordinances for newly seized frontier towns, ensuring that the transition from Islamic to Christian jurisdiction maintained economic stability. The Crown's reliance on this scholarly elite created a knowledge monopoly that protected the community's status even as religious tensions escalated. By serving as the state's cartographers, diplomats, and senior clerks, the Jewish elite integrated themselves into the cognitive functions of the Spanish monarchy. They were the primary architects of the administrative continuity required to absorb a conquered Islamic population into a Christian realm. This intellectual utility functioned as a non-monetary credit, securing their presence in the royal court through the sheer complexity of the statecraft they managed on behalf of Ferdinand and Isabella. The 1489 siege of Baza served as the definitive financial breaking point of the Reconquista, necessitating an unprecedented emergency mobilization of capital to prevent the total dissolution of the Christian forces. Lasting 6 months, the campaign incurred costs that exhausted the established juro and tax farming structures, forcing the Catholic monarchs to utilize their most intimate assets as collateral. Queen Isabella's decision to pawn the crown jewels, including the collar de ballages and the Saint Ferdinand crown, was the catalyst for a massive infusion of liquidity provided by Jewish financiers in Valencia and Seville. This transaction was overseen by specialized royal officials, known as justices, who functioned as receivers for the royal chamber. Unlike previous fiscal agents, these justices managed the immediate liquidation of communal silver and the direct transfer of outstanding noble debts to the crown to sustain the Swiss mercenaries and heavy artillery corps. This period was characterized by the forced advancement of capital, where the Jewish elite were required to underwrite the army's survival without the traditional guarantees of future tax yields. The justices implemented a system of debt swapping, where the king's immediate liabilities to his soldiers were transferred to Jewish creditors in exchange for titles to future confiscated Moorish estates. This administrative maneuver turned the siege into a massive debt conversion exercise, effectively monetizing the potential value of Granada before its actual capture. By the time the Nasrid garrison at Baza capitulated, the Castilian treasury had been replaced by a network of private Jewish bridge loans, totaling approximately 60 million maravedis. This extreme level of fiscal overextension demonstrated that the war had moved beyond the capacity of the state, relying instead on the total absorption of Jewish wealth to maintain military momentum during the conflict's most precarious strategic juncture. The construction of Santa Fe in late 1491 marked the final transition from a seasonal military blockade to a permanent urban occupation of the Vega of Granada. Following the accidental destruction of the Gozco encampment by fire, Isabella I mandated the immediate erection of a stone-built fortress city, a project requiring massive capital outlays for masonry, engineering, and a specialized labor force. This war city mirrored the Domus Lapidii found in the Jewish quarters of northern Europe, where durable stone construction functioned as a physical safeguard for liquid assets and a testament to long-term residency. Jewish financiers facilitated this architectural pivot by providing the liquidity necessary to procure limestone, timber, and the wages of thousands of artisans during a period of acute fiscal exhaustion. The grid-based design of Santa Fe, completed in 80 days, functioned as a psychological weapon of attrition, signaling to the Nasrid defenders that the Christian siege was no longer subject to seasonal withdrawal or weather-induced retreat. This project transformed the frontier into a fixed economic node, anchoring the logistics of conquest in a permanent urban fabric. The investment in Santa Fe represented a final, concentrated application of Jewish liquid assets toward a physical infrastructure of sovereignty. By underwriting the transition from temporary tents to fortified stone, the Jewish elite enabled the creation of a definitive administrative hub that rendered the fall of Granada a logistical inevitability. This permanent camp functioned as a multifunctional center for judicial processes and royal administration, mirroring the institutional density of the Vicus Judiorum. The city served as a physical manifestation of the crown's refusal to negotiate, underpinned by a financial architecture that treated the landscape of war as a fixed capital investment. As the military campaign converged on the final siege of 1491, the institutional security of the Jewish community entered a state of terminal volatility, characterized by the collapse of the legal protections once afforded by royal utility. This precarity was catalyzed by the 1478 establishment of the Holy Office, which systematically eroded the jurisdictional autonomy of the algemas. While Jewish capital remained essential for the maintenance of the military garrison, the rising influence of the Dominican order and the radicalized clergy transformed the successes of the Reconquista into a mandate for absolute religious homogeneity. This social antagonism was formally weaponized through the 1491 Holy Child of LaGuardia trial, a fabricated ritual murder allegation used to link the Jewish community with a perceived existential threat to the Christian state. Simultaneously, the Catholic monarch's fiscal landscape shifted as the exhaustion of traditional tax farms forced a reliance on rival Genoese and Converso banking houses. This diversification of the crown's credit sources rendered the traditional Jewish financiers fiscally redundant at the very moment their social capital was most depleted. The volatile personal finances of Ferdinand and Isabella meant that the protection of the royal chamber was increasingly traded for the political support of the church and the nobility, who demanded the cessation of Jewish influence as the price for further parliamentary subsidies. Consequently, the legal status of the Jewish subjects was no longer protected by their administrative expertise, as the burgeoning state bureaucracy began to favor converted agents who shared the dominant faith. This period of intense precarity demonstrated the failure of the financial vertical alliance. The community's wealth, once a shield, became a target for confiscation as the state sought to resolve its massive war debts through the potential for wholesale appropriation. The surrender of Muhammad Fushab on January 2, 1492, effectively concluded a military enterprise that had functioned for a decade as a massive debt-leveraged operation. This geopolitical transition marked the successful conversion of approximately 1 billion maravedis in Jewish-managed credit into the physical acquisition of the Nasrid kingdom. At the moment, the Christian standards were raised over the Alhambra. The Sephardic elite occupied the highest tier of the state's fiscal hierarchy. Having successfully bridged the final liquidity gap that had threatened to bankrupt the treasury after the exhausting campaign at Bazaar. The victory was as much an achievement of the Contadura Mayor as it was of the cavalry, with Jewish administrative facilitators having managed the complex settlement of arrears for the Swiss mercenaries and the professional heavy artillery corps. The surrender treaties, or capitulaciones, which initially guaranteed religious and legal concessions to the Muslim population, were refined by Jewish jurists whose proficiency in Semitic law and Mediterranean diplomacy remained a critical asset during the immediate transition of power. This pinnacle of sovereign utility appeared to validate the gamble taken by Senior and Abravanel that financial indispensability would secure a permanent communal sanctuary within the new imperial order. The monarchs now possessed a unified territory and a centralized administrative hub in Santa Fe, both of which had been constructed upon a foundation of private Jewish bridge loans and long-term juro annuities. However, the eradication of the final Islamic frontier fundamentally altered the Crown's fiscal requirements. With a military objective achieved, the specialized credit mechanisms and transnational networks that had sustained the blockade were no longer a strategic necessity for territorial expansion. The handover of the keys symbolized the end of the war of attrition. Yet for the financiers, it represented the final delivery on a contract that the unified monarchy was now incentivized to void. Following the cessation of hostilities in January 1492, the Jewish financial elite achieved a localized zenith of influence, serving as the primary underwriters for the transition of the Spanish monarchy from a crusading power to a global maritime empire. This brief interval was defined by the deployment of capital toward non-military monumental projects, most notably the initial financing of the Atlantic expeditions. While the crown jewels had been pawned at Bazaar, the immediate liquidity for the voyage of Christopher Columbus was secured through a massive bridge loan of 1.4 million maravedis, largely facilitated by Isaac Abravanel and the Treasury officials who had successfully managed the residual Granada war chest. Beyond maritime exploration, Jewish credit financed the rapid expansion of the royal bureaucracy and the establishment of new judicial chanceries in Granada and Ciudad Real. The financiers operated as the principal architects of the state's fiscal unification, consolidating the disparate accounting practices of Castile and Aragon into a single centralized hacienda. This period saw the Jewish elite functioning as indispensable administrative assistants in the reconstruction of the realm, managing the sale of confiscated Nasrid properties and the redistribution of vacant lands to loyalist nobility. Their specialized expertise in the legalities of land transfer and tax assessment ensured that the territorial gains of the Reconquista were immediately monetized into state revenue. The royal court, briefly settled in the Alhambra, relied on Jewish cartographers and polyglot diplomats to manage initial contact with foreign powers and the papacy regarding the new territorial boundaries. For this short duration, the institutional integration of Jewish wealth and intellectual capital into the core functions of the monarchy appeared absolute. The community's role had evolved from wartime necessity to the essential engine of a nascent global power, creating an illusion of permanent sanctuary within the newly consolidated imperial framework. The consolidation of the Spanish state following the conquest of Granada precipitated a structural transformation in the crown's credit requirements, shifting reliance away from the traditional Jewish financiers toward a new architecture dominated by Genoese and Converso banking houses. This transition was catalyzed by the arrival of powerful Italian merchant bankers, such as Francesco Pinelli and Luis de la Cerda, who provided Ferdinand and Isabella with access to the vast liquidity of the Mediterranean maritime republics. Unlike the Jewish arrendadores, whose wealth was frequently tied to the localized collection of Castilian tax farms, the Genoese offered a globalized financial infrastructure capable of supporting the monarchy's expanding imperial ambitions. The strategic utility of the Jewish elite was further eroded by the rise of a high-tier converso administrative class, individuals of Jewish descent who, as nominal Christians, were not subject to the legal and religious restrictions of the algemas. These agents successfully co-opted the specialized accounting and fiscal management roles previously monopolized by the Jewish community, rendering the non-converted financiers fiscally obsolete. By 1492, the Crown had secured alternative lines of credit that were not hindered by the political and social liabilities of the Jewish problem. The Genoese firms, in particular, offered superior terms for the management of the royal custom revenues and the financing of the burgeoning wool trade, utilizing their expansive networks in Bruges and London to settle Spanish debts without the ecclesiastical complications associated with Jewish usury. This diversification of the royal debt meant that the double-edged sword of Jewish utility had lost its edge. The monarchy no longer required the specific bridge loans that had sustained the decade-long siege of Granada. The depletion of communal utility occurred precisely as the populist and clerical demands for religious unification reached their zenith. With the military objective achieved and the new financial architecture established, the Jewish financiers were transformed from indispensable strategic partners into a dispensable fiscal relic. This obsolescence removed the final pragmatic barrier to expulsion, as the state's financial machinery could now function seamlessly without the participation of the very community that had engineered its original solvency. Signed on March 31, 1492, within the Alhambra, the Edictum de Expulsione, or Alhambra Decree, represented the definitive administrative closure of the Jewish presence in the Spanish realms. This document, drafted by the Royal Council and influenced by the Grand Inquisitor Thomas de Torquemada, utilized a specific legal framing that shifted the status of Jewish subjects from protected fiscal agents to a perceived source of domestic religious contagion. The preamble explicitly cited the grave injury caused by the proximity of Jewish communities to the new Christian or converso class, arguing that the continued presence of the aljamas impeded the state's efforts toward total religious homogeneity. Unlike previous localized restrictions, this was a trans-regional mandate encompassing the entirety of the crowns of Castile and Aragon, permitting no legal exceptions or jurisdictional exemptions. The decree imposed a rigid 4-month deadline, mandating that all Jews who refused baptism must vacate Spanish territory by July 31, 1492. A critical provision of the edict prohibited the export of gold, silver, minted coinage, and horses, assets categorized as strategic state resources. This measure functioned as a secondary confiscatory tool, effectively trapping the community's liquid wealth within the peninsula and forcing families to exchange their physical specie for paper-based bills of exchange or low-value movable goods. Administrative heralds disseminated the decree to every municipal authority with extreme urgency, effectively terminating the Servicamera Regis contract and the vertical legal protection of the monarch. The edict also mandated that all communal properties, including synagogues and hospitals, be surrendered without compensation. This legislative act was not a spontaneous religious response, but a calculated exercise of sovereign power, executed only after the new Genoese credit infrastructure had rendered the community's traditional financial utility obsolete. The signing formalized the total excision of the Jewish minority from the body politic initiating a massive logistical operation that converted an entire demographic into a stateless refugee class. The fiscal stabilization of the post-war Spanish state in 1492 necessitated a definitive political bargain between the Catholic monarchs and the Christian estates. While the conquest of Granada provided territorial expansion, it left the treasury with a recurrent deficit and a massive debt portfolio held by Jewish financiers. Ferdinand and Isabella faced an immediate requirement for an extraordinary subsidy to fund the burgeoning administrative costs of the unified realm and the proposed Atlantic ventures. This necessity provided the Castilian nobility and the high clergy with decisive political leverage to enforce a policy of total religious excision. During the convocation of the Cortes in early 1492, the representatives of the shires and the grandees made their financial cooperation conditional upon the termination of the Jewish legal status. This political calculus was driven by the desire of the aristocracy to eliminate their recorded liabilities. The removal of the Jewish community functioned as a strategic mechanism for debt cancellation. By acceding to the expulsion, the Crown effectively performed a sovereign default on the private loans that had underwritten the decade-long siege. The nobility offered a massive tax grant, totaling approximately 150 million maravedis in direct exchange for the Edict of Expulsion. This subsidy allowed the monarchs to transition from an ad hoc system of Jewish bridge loans to a permanent, state-controlled tax base managed by the new Genoese-backed fiscal architecture. The decision was a cold exchange of the kingdom's specialized financial class for the long-term political compliance of the feudal lords and the church. The monarchs prioritized the power of the purse held by the Christian parliament over the administrative utility of their Jewish agents. This maneuver successfully consolidated royal authority by removing a unique class of financiers who symbolized the Crown's historic capacity for arbitrary fiscal independence. The expulsion was thus the final installment of a political transaction that converted human capital into the legislative and financial stability of the nascent Spanish Empire. The publication of the Alhambra Decree initiated a 4-month window of systemic economic devaluation, as approximately 200,000 individuals were simultaneously compelled to liquidate their non-portable assets. This sudden supply shock, concentrated within a rigid legal deadline, triggered a profound depression in local real estate and commodity markets across Castile and Aragon, because the edict strictly prohibited the export of gold, silver, and minted coinage. The departing population was forced into bartered exchanges or paper-based credit instruments of highly dubious value. Christian buyers, cognizant of the non-negotiable July 31st departure date, engaged in predatory purchasing, often acquiring substantial stone residences, vineyards, and industrial workshops for a fraction of their intrinsic worth. Historical records indicate that significant estates were frequently exchanged for a single beast of burden or a few bolts of cloth, representing a near-total destruction of Jewish capital. To move value across the border, the exiles relied on bills of exchange issued by converso, or Italian bankers, who charged exorbitant service fees and applied predatory exchange rates, sometimes resulting in a 50 to 80% loss of the principal's purchasing power. The Crown further intensified this fiscal friction by appointing royal commissioners to audit all transactions, ensuring that any outstanding debts owed by Jewish individuals were satisfied before they were permitted to depart. Simultaneously, the state asserted its claim over all uncollected debts owed to Jews, effectively nationalizing the community's remaining credit portfolio. This period of forced liquidation facilitated one of the most significant transfers of wealth in the pre-modern era, as centuries of accumulated Jewish capital were absorbed into the Christian urban fabric. By the time the embarkation points were reached, the community's financial infrastructure had been systematically dismantled, leaving the majority of the exiles with only the minimal portable possessions permitted by royal prerogative. Following the expiration of the July 31st deadline, The Spanish crown initiated the systematic appropriation of all immovable assets belonging to the Jewish algemas, an administrative process that formally extinguished the community's physical footprint. Unlike the movable goods liquidated during the 4-month window, real estate was legally categorized as abandoned property, triggering an automatic reversion to the patrimonio real or royal patrimony. The most significant institutional targets were the synagogues, which were not merely seized, but structurally repurposed to serve the state's ideological mandate of religious uniformity. Many of these structures were formally transferred to the Catholic Church or the Inquisition to be converted into parishes, hospitals, or monasteries, such as the transition of the Great Synagogue of Toledo into a Christian sanctuary. This process allowed the state to preserve high-quality urban masonry while erasing the ritual utility of the buildings. The high-value stone houses, or domus lapidei, located within the formerly protected Jewish quarters, were utilized by Ferdinand and Isabella as a non-specie form of compensation for the military and administrative class. By distributing these titles to loyalist nobles and civil servants who had participated in the Granada campaign, the crown satisfied its outstanding feudal obligations without depleting its limited liquid reserves. Simultaneously, Jewish cemeteries underwent a process of commercial liquidation. The land was frequently sold for agricultural expansion or urban development. While the tombstones were categorized as raw building material, these stones were sold to municipal councils and repurposed for the construction of fortifications, bridges, and public edifices, effectively integrating the physical remains of the community into the new Christian infrastructure. This systematic seizure was managed by the Real Hacienda, which utilized the detailed communal registers from the tax farming era to audit and claim every asset. This final appropriation of immovable wealth ensured that the administrative excision of the Jewish community was accompanied by a total structural absorption of their physical legacy. The Spanish crown issued salvi conductus, or royal safe conducts, to regulate the exodus of the Jewish population, theoretically placing the refugees under the sovereign's peace during their transit to the frontier. These documents were intended to maintain civil order and ensure the population reached designated ports of embarkation, such as Laredo, Cartagena, and El Puerto de Santa Maria, without triggering localized uprisings. However, the enforcement of these protections was delegated to municipal alguaciles and frontier officials, whose commitment to royal orders was often secondary to the opportunity for petty extraction. While the edict guaranteed physical passage, it did not exempt the exiles from a gauntlet of head taxes and inflated transit tolls levied at every provincial border, which functioned as the final mechanism for draining the community's remaining liquid assets. Opportunistic plunder became a systemic feature of the journey, as the refugees traveled along fixed routes that were easily intercepted by local militias and bandits. A specific form of anatomical exploitation emerged from the widespread rumor that exiles had swallowed gold ducats or gemstones to circumvent the ban on bullion export. This led to invasive physical searches and violent assaults conducted by both land-based highwaymen and the very escorts assigned to protect the caravans. The maritime phase introduced further hazards. Shipmasters frequently demanded supplementary payments once vessels reached open water, threatening to maroon passengers on uninhabited islands or sell them to Barbary corsairs. The salvi conductus proved to be a mere paper shield, providing the state with administrative regularity while failing to mitigate the predatory environment of the Mediterranean. This logistical crisis transformed the regulated departure into a chaotic dispersal, ensuring that the final residue of Jewish capital was consumed by the transport industry and the opportunistic greed of the frontier. The administrative finality of the expulsion was achieved through the systematic seizure of the arche, the communal chests containing the legal records of all outstanding Jewish credits. Under the principle of royal prerogative, the crown declared that all uncollected debts owed to the exiles were now the property of the Real Hacienda. Royal commissioners, specifically the jueces de los bienes de los expulsos, were dispatched to every aljama to secure these archives before they could be destroyed or smuggled out. These chests held thousands of escrituras, notarized contracts for censos, commercial loans, and personal indentures. The king's possession of these documents meant that Christian debtors, particularly the high nobility, remained legally bound to fulfill their obligations to the state treasury rather than receiving a de facto debt cancellation. The Contaduría Mayor de Cuentas utilized these records to create a master ledger of the kingdom's private indebtedness, allowing for the targeted extraction of capital from the Christian aristocracy in the years following 1492. This move transitioned the kingdom's financial data from a decentralized private network into a centralized state archive. It ensured that the expulsion did not disrupt the flow of interest-bearing capital, but merely redirected its destination. By seizing the physical documentation of the debt, the monarchs gained a permanent fiscal lever over their subjects, turning the departure of the lenders into a windfall for the royal chamber. This process included the rigorous auditing of communal ledgers to identify hidden assets or secret loans that had not been officially registered. The state asserted its right to pursue these obligations through the royal courts, treating the Jewish account books as infallible legal evidence. Consequently, the conversion of the Arca represented the ultimate nationalization of the private credit market, providing the Spanish state with the data required to manage its post-war fiscal stability. The completion of the expulsion in late 1492 represented the final administrative stage of cultural excision, transforming the Iberian urban landscape into a monolithic confessional space. This process was codified through the systematic deletion of Jewish names from municipal census rolls and the padrones of the Royal Tax Authority. The Crown initiated a campaign of toponymic revision, renaming streets and districts previously known as Juderias to reflect Christian hagiography and the new triumphalist order. This administrative purge extended to the destruction or concealment of the Pinkasim, the communal minute books that recorded the internal governance of the aljamas, effectively severing the continuity of local historical memory. The vacuum left by the specialized administrative class was filled by the letrados, a new cadre of university-trained Christian bureaucrats who applied Roman law to standardize the kingdom's legal procedures. These officials oversaw the Christianization of the mercantile economy, replacing the informal networks of trust that had defined Jewish commerce with rigid guild statutes that mandated limpieza de sangre for entry. The state's intervention in the domestic sphere included the banning of Hebrew inscriptions in public architecture and the systematic removal of Jewish ritual objects from private residences. This transition marked the institutionalization of the Estado Moderno, where sovereignty was no longer predicated on the management of diverse corporate groups, but on the enforcement of a singular identity. By late 1492, the physical and administrative apparatus of the Spanish state had successfully internalized the wealth and expertise of its former Jewish subjects while legally pathologizing their legacy. The result was a tabula rasa that provided the ideological foundation for the Spanish Golden Age, where the absence of the Jewish other became the primary signifier of national and religious integrity. The expulsion was thus finalized not just as a physical removal, but as a total erasure of the community's civic and cultural legitimacy. If you found this history interesting, this next video will shock you. Click right here to watch it now.